Hello, ladies. Our story today is found in Matthew 15:21-28, the faith of the Syro-Phoenician woman. She counted the coins carefully before placing them in the pouch that hung around her neck, and then she took her young daughter by the hand and stepped into the early morning sunlight. "Are you ready for market, my flower?" The girl nodded her head enthusiastically. Big brown eyes fringed with long lashes crinkled as the child smiled up at her. The mother paused for a moment and bent down and lovingly brushed the long ebony ringlets from her face. She cupped the little girl's chin in her hand for a moment and scanned her face anxiously before placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I love you, little one," she whispered. "I love you, Mummy." Mother and daughter began walking toward the center of town hand in hand. The main road to Zarephath was paved with large stones. The houses on either side of the road were close together, but as mother and daughter drew closer to the center of town, residences increasingly gave way to commerce. Metallurgists worked over glowing kilns. Sparks flew and hammers fell as the sound of the craft drifted through the village. Nearby, a potter sat in the sun painting a floral pattern on a bowl as delicate as eggshells. His brush dipped over and again into red and then yellow as he created a work of art for some rich man's table. Soon the pair neared the pride of Zarephath, the dryer shop. Folded lengths of luxurious purple cloth were stacked neatly for display on a table near the entrance. On a line nearby, still wet fabric, dark as wine, rippled and danced in the steady ocean breeze. The dryer bent over his work. He held a rough sea snail, a murex, in his hand. With expert precision, he pried open the shell and extracted a white vein from the snail. With steady hands, he began to harvest a yellow fluid from the veins, letting it drip into a glass vial. As soon as the liquid came in contact with the air, it changed from yellow to a dark rose color. When this liquid was diluted, the result was the prized purple dye. Suddenly, the little girl stopped walking. She abruptly turned her head hard to one side and began to moan and cry. She wrenched her hand from her mother's and began pacing back and forth as she mumbled and then laughed to herself. And as suddenly as the frantic pacing began, it stilled. She stood frozen for a moment and then slowly turned toward the dryer shop. For the mother, time seemed to stop as every detail about the moment came into crisp focus. The fishy smell of the dye as it sloshed gently against the glass vial. The sound of 1,000 crushed murex shells crunching beneath the child's sandals as she began to run. And then the little girl's small hand grasping the vial of precious liquid with unnatural suddenness. The dryer was shocked for a moment, and then he roared his anger and grasped for the vial. The child stepped deftly out of his reach and then dangled the fragile container aloft at the arm's length. Without uttering a word, she had clearly communicated her threat. The red-faced dyer took a deep breath and stepped back. His jaw was set and his nostrils flared in fury, but he did not risk moving or speaking. He stood perfectly still, keeping one weary eye on the child while watching as his mother quietly approached her from behind. The mother held her breath. Her eyes were fixed on the expensive dye in the child's hand. The murex shells being crunched underfoot seemed as loud as the waves crashing on the shore. Beads of sweat gathered on her forehead as she neared the little girl. And then, just as she reached around her from behind to grasp the vial, the child smiled and released her grip. The delicate glass jostled for a moment between their hands, and the rose-colored dye sloshed up the sides, and by some miracle, the woman caught and secured the vial in a trembling palm. She took a deep breath and carefully handed it back to the owner. He began threatening her and shouting his condemnation and wrath, but she didn't hear. As soon as the vial was secure, the child became filled with rage. The mother picked her up and attempted to leave the shop with her, but the little girl now possessed an unearthly strength. Her small fist rained down on her mother, and the child screamed and dragged her fingernails across her mother's face, drawing blood. And once they were in the street, the entire town stopped to watch the struggle. Looking around for some place to get the child out of sight, the mother spotted an alleyway that led behind the dyer's shop and to the shore. Weeping, she picked up the raging child, soothing her through her tears. "My flower, my flower." And suddenly the child stopped still, drew back in her mother's arms, and looked directly into her face. But it was not her little girl peering out from behind the eyes. "Your flower," a girl voice sneered. "Your flower isn't here." The mother began to sob, begging for her child. "Please, please leave my baby. What do you want from me?" A deep, menacing laugh of pure evil shook the child. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she screamed before collapsing unconscious in her mother's arms. The weary mother sat down against the nearby wall next to the dryer's pool of murex. She turned her face to the sea and closed her eyes. The gentle ocean breeze drew her black hair from her face as she took deep breaths, shuddering attempts to calm her soul. A few moments later, the child sleepily lifted her head. She stared up at her mother for a moment before gently lifting a small hand to pat at the tear on her mother's face. She frowned and tenderly touched the bloody red welts on her mom's cheeks. "Mommy, what happened to your face?" "Oh, it's nothing," she responded with an exhausted half-smile. The child looked down and spotted the snail pools. She scrambled from her mother's lap to lie weakly by the pools and peer into the depths. She reached out and gently trailed one small finger across the surface of the water. A little while later, after they returned home and the child lay napping in her bed, the mother began working in the kitchen. The dough moved expertly in her strong hands, but her thoughts were far from her kneading bowl. As she had passed through the market on her way home, she had heard that Jesus of Nazareth was in town. His fame had spread throughout the entire region because of his mighty miracles he performed. Some of the Jews even whispered that he was the son of David, the Messiah. Oh, this was not his first trip to the region. He had previously visited nearby Tyre and Sidon. She heard he was not only mighty, but he offered compassion to all, Jew and Gentile alike. Most Jewish men would never even speak to a Gentile, and certainly not a Gentile woman. But this man was rumored to be different. At that moment, the child began moaning in her sleep. The mother closed her eyes and took a deep breath and wearily pulled her hands from the dough. She wiped them on a towel tied to her waist as her little girl now began to scream. Turning to kneel beside the child's bed, she saw that the little girl's body was rigid. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her face was purple. Staring at her precious daughter for a moment, the mother knew exactly what she had to do. She needed help. She needed someone not only stronger than the demon, but someone who was willing to help her. She could think of only one person. She bent to kiss her daughter gently on the forehead and whisper a silent prayer for her protection. She went to the door and took one last look back at her daughter before pulling it closed, and then she began running toward the center of town. Oh, it didn't take long to find him. She simply looked for the crowd. She began weaving her way in and out of people, pushing past the unyielding and ignoring their dirty looks. When Jesus was in sight, she began calling out to him, combining his messianic title with a cry of a beggar. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." He turned to the sound of her voice, and when his eyes met hers, she saw a deep compassion there. His disciples, however, stared back at her in obvious disgust. They considered her a woman and a Gentile, defiled, unclean, and unworthy of their time. Jesus turned from her and looked at his disciples, and for the briefest of moments, she saw irritation register on his face and then determination. He looked her way once more and then turned away. She moved closer. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me," she pleaded. The disciples turned to Jesus. "Send her away, for she keeps crying after us." Jesus looked deep into the woman's eyes and entrusted to her a great test. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel," he remarked. A tense silence fell over the crowd as their eyes searched his face. Could it be? No, she didn't believe it. She didn't believe he would turn away from her so coldly. She dropped to her knees before him, and as tears streamed down her face, uttered the purest cry of her desperate soul, "Lord, help me!" Compassion flickered in his eyes as he saw the full depth of her anguish. Then he made a decision to lay it bare for all to see. He knew that at the core of her wound lay a gem of courage and faith that would last begin to uproot from his disciples, the future leader of the church, the deep embedded sin of prejudice. He would use her heart-wrenching situation to expose their prejudicial attitudes. Their sin would be clearly revealed by the bright light of her suffering and faith. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs," he replied. Oh, she could have responded angrily to such a callous insult, but she didn't. She pressed on in the belief that Jesus was not only mighty enough to help her, but willing as well. She believed with all her heart that this Jewish rabbi was different from the rest. Once more, the stillness of expectation settled over the crowd as her eyes remained locked on the eyes of Jesus. "Yes, Lord," she said. "Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Jesus smiled down at her and shook his head. She had passed the most difficult of tests, and in the process helped him teach his disciples a powerful lesson. "O woman," he said, "great is your faith. Be it done unto you as you desire." Son of David, have mercy on me. When I am exhausted, broken-hearted, and worn thin by fear, have mercy on me. Help me to remember that the most difficult tests you give me are not cruelties, but honors, and grant me the grace in those moments to cling to what I know to be true, and to await your deliverance in quiet confidence and perfect peace. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.